Hey, welcome to Lab, the podcast. I'm so grateful to share the opportunity to have some time with pastor and author Courtney Ellis. Courtney's a pastor and author of 6 books, most recently Looking Up, A Birder's Guide to Hope Through Grief, and the upcoming Weathering Change, Seeking Peace Amid Life's Tough Transitions, both with InterVarsity. She's an avid birder and hosts the podcast The Thing with Feathers, all about birds and hope. And Courtney and her husband serve Presbyterian Church of the Master in Southern California, where they are raising 3 kids. Courtney, thank you amidst all of that for making time to hang out with us. We appreciate it.
Oh, it's so good to be with you, Zach. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, you were working on book 2, but you wrote a really beautiful book while you were walking through a really real season of grief yourself. So first, I'm sorry for the loss that you experienced with the death of your grandfather. But we're thankful for the way that you walked through that and gave time and attention to writing this really, really beautiful book. So thank you.
Oh, thank you for reading.
Yeah. We met through Ashley, who's a part of our team. One of the members of V3's team has a relative out on the other side of the country in your neck of the woods. And she made the connection and she suggested that I pick up a copy of your book. And so I did, and I dove in and I was reading it really with 2 lenses. I have my dad is facing a terminal illness right now. So just on a personal level, I'm walking through that with our family and navigating all of that. And I was reading it with so many friends and family who are navigating that same space or have recently. So it's on a lot of our minds. And I picked up the book and I have all sorts of thoughts about how I felt with the pastoral way that you wrote. But there's something really special for me as a reader with this book. You've written 6 books. Does this one feel maybe unique or different as you have it up on your shelf? There's always something about a book that kind of pulses with a certain something, and even when you're the author. So how does this one feel in the collection of the work that you've been able to write?
This one really feels in many ways like the book of my life. Like this, there is just something so special about being able to tell a deep and tender family story, but also tell it through the lens of theology and my own pastorate, and then the beauty and grace of the natural world and how birds, for so many people, it's grief that first gets them into birds and birding. They get into it because the cancer was back or they lost their job or the divorce was finalized. And so to weave these things together really felt, I mean, in many ways, writing is always a bit of inspiration, but this one felt like God kind of handed it to me in a way, and I still had to make something of it, but those threads don't naturally weave. And I really feel like um, there was some Holy Spirit help in weaving them together and trying to tell such a tender family story in a tender way, but not have it just be a memoir because, my life is frankly not that interesting. But what is interesting is the work of God in the world and the ways the book of nature can minister to us in our grief, and the ways that grief is a really universal story, that we will all walk through that valley of the shadow of death with our loved ones, with our friends, and eventually on our own.
Yeah. Yeah, there is an aliveness to your writing that's really cool. I think you describe it as Holy Spirit inspired or animated. And I think you're right that's the creative process is so fun when I think Rick Rubin and Pharrell were talking about this, that they were talking about musical artists and saying that
Yeah.
the best music is coming from people of faith. And one of the 2 of them said it's because the Spirit is moving through them. And I think in
Yeah.
authoring a book, especially this one, as I read, there was a really gentle breeze between personal story and pastoral guidance and spiritual formation. And all of it was just kind of happening as we meandered around looking at birds, which it was really, really beautiful. So well done. You talk in it about COVID and anxiety and grief and loss and hope. We'll touch on all of those, but let's start with Birder. There's maybe somebody out there listening who doesn't even know what we're talking about when we say she is an avid birder. So introduce us to being a birder, and when would you say on a time line that you first could say, I became a birder?
I became a birder at the start of the pandemic. As is true for so many new birders. We all started in 2020 because there wasn't much you could do safely, but you could look out your window and you could walk around outside. So we all started to do that. And the statistics bear that out. I mean, sales of bird seed and bird feeders and binoculars were just off the chart, like more than doubled during COVID, because that was most people who got into birding during the pandemic, that was what happened for them as well. And it was actually 2 weeks before the pandemic started. I had a friend visit and she looked out my window and she said, "You have a Phoebe." And I said, I don't know what that is. I don't recognize that word. I know what a sparrow is. I know what a hawk is. And she said, "Oh, it's a type of flycatcher. They're black and white. They're very territorial. They eat mosquitoes. You're happy to have them there." And I looked and I saw this little bird, this black and white bird. And she said, "If it's been in your yard, it'll probably stay in your yard. It'll probably hang out in your yard." And I thought, I've never seen that bird before in my life. I've been living here for 2 years. And what else haven't I noticed?
Hmm.
And so that, and then the pandemic started 2 weeks later, and I started going on lots of walks for my mental health, as so many of us did, and realized the birds were everywhere. And I'm here in Southern California. It's one of the most biodiverse places for birding in the entire United States. And I started to think, what else haven't I noticed? What else have I been missing? And the birds have always been here. They've always been singing. They've always been present in the trees. And so birding is just going out and looking for birds. It can even be out your window. And the bar for birding is very low. So if you're appreciating a crow in the grocery store parking lot, you're birding. If you're flying to Antarctica to see penguins, you're birding. Kids can bird, older people can bird. You can bird if you have mobility issues. You can bird if you have certain disabilities. There are groups that go out birding and they bird by ear because they have visual impairment, or they bird by sight because they have hearing impairment. So birding it's the great unifier. It has potential to bring us all together. And people tell me all the time, "I'm not a birder." And I say, no, 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 you're not a birder yet. If you live long enough, birding will come for you.
Yeah, I love it. Well, one of my favorite poems is "One Day I'll Visit Hawk Mountain." I don't know if you're familiar with this poem, but she talks in the poem about being a bad birder. And she says, "One
Yes.
one day I'll be a bad birder because I care little of." And it's a beautiful poem. We'll do a poetry podcast on that one. But I think I have a t-shirt that says I'm a bad birder because of that poem. So I don't know if I would call myself a birder, but I can say I'm a bad birder. But I love it how different seasons do invite us to discover something that maybe what was there the whole time we weren't paying attention. You talk about birding as paying attention, in that being essential to what it is to be human. So we'll get into that. But how has birding changed the way that you pastor now? I mean, the pandemic shaped that as well, but just how has it shaped the way that you are with people and the way that you think about texts and all of the other things that are in the life of a pastor?
Oh, what a great question. Birding influences everything I do because it has taught me how to pay more close and loving attention to one particular thing, which is birds, but then it flows over into everything else. Because so often as a pastor, my office is open. I'm here all the time. People could stop by, but they don't. And so it's on me to notice they're carrying their shoulders in a different way, like something has happened. That looks like grief. That looks like pain. That looks like sorrow. And so when you spend so much time looking at the difference in, an eye ring or a wing bar or the shape of a tail, you learn to see your neighbors more lovingly and more closely. You learn to notice things that normally would have just passed you by. And so much of birding is about paying attention, but also so much about prayer is about paying attention. It's about attentiveness. And I am not a person who's good at being still. I struggled for years with my prayer life because I was like, I have to sit here in this chair and focus, and that is not going to work for me. But when I'm out walking and looking for birds, it is such a natural way to pray because I'm naturally tuned in to what's happening around me, which helps me to tune in to what's happening internally, which helps me tune into the work of the Holy Spirit. So I can't say enough about birding as a spiritual practice. It's changed my life. And maybe for your listeners, they're thinking the bird lady is crazy. I'm not into birds. But maybe for you, it's baking sourdough and it's the attention you're paying to that sourdough starter, or it's painting, or it's sitting on the floor with your kids and building Legos. What is that thing that gets you in touch with that spirit of attentiveness that flows out into prayer and into loving your neighbor?
Yeah. You say, and we'll just turn here because we're on it, but you literally say birding teaches us to pay attention. And then you say, I think that this is the very heart of what it means to be a person. And when I was thinking in the book, as I was reading, I just wrote, say more about that. And I would love
Mm.
for you to, I think right now, the art of paying attention, the economy of distraction that we exist in, there is like an anti-human thing happening to us, even subconsciously. It's just in the air. And so I think it's really important. I wanted to ask you, just say more about, what do you mean that paying attention is at the heart of what it means to be a human?
I think it was Simone Weil who said, and I'm paraphrasing the quote, but absolute unmixed attention is prayer. And you're right, with the current attention economy, we're pulled in 37,000 different directions before breakfast, and everything wants our time and our clicks and our money. And that pulls us out of this deep focus, and it kind of retrains us in this scattershot focus that I think is, like you said, it's almost subhuman. We're not designed to be constantly distracted and unmoored. And so these deep spiritual practices that get us outdoors, that get us to be quiet, that get us off of our phones, that get us to look into the eyes of our neighbors, reconnect us to the divine, to the force of all life, to Jesus, to the Holy Spirit. Um, who, Jesus was a master of looking right into someone's heart and right into their eyes and giving them the time that they needed, but also withdrawing to be with his Father. He wasn't constantly pulled in 1,000 directions. And so to balance that as a pastor, to balance that as a parent, I can't tell you how many nights by bedtime I'm toast, and the
Mm,
kids know it. We have three kids, 13 and 9 and 7, and they know I'm toast. And so the temptation to pull into my phone and to be not present to them because I'm tired and bedtime is hard, is the temptation to be less human with them, to be less present to them. And so birding is really one of those things that helps me work against that. It puts me in touch with my own nerve endings
mm,
again.
mm. Yeah, I love that. And yeah, I think for everybody listening, what a great invitation, even before we dive into the book, that maybe you never thought of yourself as a birder, or that, maybe birding won't become your thing, but it's flowers or sourdough or whatever it is. Pay attention to the invitation to pay attention as a way of countering that dehumanizing, anti human force that just steals life and beauty. We talk about like the life and beauty of the gospel, and that can float off and be an abstraction, but it's really an invitation to say, no, something happens. The glory of God is man fully alive, beholding the glory of God. That's where we're most human. And that's true for all of us. And there's something beautiful in the world when we put away our phone and start paying attention and recover that. So how do we do that? Maybe birding is the thing that will teach you to pay attention. But great artists invite us to pay attention. We say it probably every podcast. Frederick Buechner said, artists invite us to pay attention. And that's what you have done in this book, is said, let's look, and you've framed grief as an avenue to hope, and said, let's just pay attention to grief as an avenue of hope. So just introduce the book, if you would. Introduce Looking Up and this avenue to hope through grief. Just do an introduction. And maybe if you could, did you have somebody in mind that you were writing to as you thought about your grief and your process and put your pen down? Who did you imagine might pick this book up?
I wrote it for the grievers, and specifically the grievers who are feeling alone in their grief, who are feeling unseen in their grief. Our culture really does not do grief well. You get an average of 3 days off of work for the death of a spouse. I mean, the shock hasn't even worn off at that point. And so I think to be a companion to someone on the road of grief is such a great gift, to remind them that they're not alone, and not just because I've walked the road or a similar road to the one they're walking, but because God is on that road around every corner. That, the psalmist writes, he hems us in behind and before and on every side. And to remind people that grief is normal, that grief is holy, that grief is a sign of love, that you only grieve deeply if you've loved deeply. And so the book came out of this desire to be a companion to people on that road of grief. And I often write the books that I looked for in a hard season that I couldn't find. Like, okay, this book needs to be written. Um, yeah, so that's where the book came to be, and then just as a way of processing my own grief in that story, and learning in the writing process that grief and hope are not opposites. They're companions. They're connected. They're friends in a way, which was surprising to me. Things keep surprising me. I've been in full-time ministry 14 years, and things keep surprising me. So here we are.
Yeah. We had the honor of talking to Dr. Lydia Dugdale. She wrote the book, The Lost Art of Dying. And I think
Yeah.
dying, obviously something that we want to avoid. Some of us in our culture deny it. We're not great at those conversations. And I think the companion there is grief. It's something that we try to avoid. You describe it as an avenue rather than something to avoid, which I think is really beautiful, that we don't have to be afraid to even just be honest that we are grieving. So I'm grateful that you wrote it for people who are grieving and feel like they're unseen, or that they can't talk about that, or that it's somehow weak to not be able to be ready to go back to work after 3 days of losing a spouse. That's unbelievable that that's kind of the standard that we think is acceptable. But it's an avenue to hope. That's really what unfolds as you carry us through the book. When you sat down, did you have the kind of a storyboard and you knew where you were going to end up? Or in this writing process, did it truly unfold as you went through the process that you were going through in grieving?
Yeah, there is a linear nature to a story of death and dying. The book begins when I find out my grandfather's fallen, and then it ends a year after as I process his death. And so in that way, the frame was there. But then the question was, how do you put those pieces together? And it is a story of death in many ways. The original first chapter was death and vultures, and my husband was like, you cannot begin your book there. People will stop reading. Like, all right, well, that'll be chapter 2 then. But as I wrote, I was really rediscovering that grief, we think of grief as connected to death and dying, but also our lives are full of lots of little griefs as well. I write about dropping an ice cream cone, like I was gonna eat that, and it's a small grief. It's a couple minutes of grief, but it's grief. Grief over the state of the world, grief over turns our lives have taken that we had hoped things would be different. And so um yeah, this idea of grief as an avenue really is that we need to walk it because it doesn't just go away. And I think, I grew up in the Midwest in a German family that just kind of has a, if you don't talk about it, it doesn't exist, type of perspective on the world. And I've really had to learn, like, not talking about it doesn't make it not real. And in many ways, it just makes you more alone in the midst of it. So I think I've lost the thread of your question. Am I circling back around to
No,
it?
it's great. It's great. No, I just appreciate being able to explore it. And I think that's what your book did. I think some of the best pastoral work is to sit down and have a place where we can, with somebody with compassionate guidance and insight, open up these things that maybe we have been avoiding, or we've been just maybe prone to skip over because that's what culturally we do, but they don't go away and they are there. So as simple as it sounds, I think I'd love to invite you to see if you could help us just get a definition. What would be a healthy definition for grief? Like, what is, in your opinion, what is grief? I know Lewis describes grief as, he said, I didn't know that it would feel so much like amputation, and that you're just
Yeah.
you're aware of missing something that belonged as a part of your story. And so it's an awareness for him that something is missing that was there or is supposed to be there. How do you, like, if somebody said, Pastor, I feel strange, and maybe it's grief. What is grief? How do you help people make sense of what is this thing, grief?
Grief is a physical and emotional and spiritual response to change. And we can have grief even over good change. My husband and I, we've been married 18 and a half years. And I remember driving away from our wedding and we were both in tears. And we looked at each other and we're like, I'm not regretting this marriage. Are you? No, no, we're not regretting the marriage. But we just realized everything that had changed in that moment and that we were driving away from the people we loved most in the world who would never be gathered in one room ever again. So yeah, grief is that threefold response to change, even good change. And there's no change bigger than death, than the death of someone you love. That's groundbreaking, that's earth shattering. But we go through so much change in our daily lives. One researcher suggests that the average adult goes through one major disorder event every 18 months, whether that's a job change or a move or a change in relationship or death in the family. And so we are all grieving all the time.
Mm.
And it does affect us physically. And I think that's something that we need to talk about more, especially within the church, and a good doctor sitting at the bedside of someone who's dying will turn to the spouse and say, be so careful this week, be so gentle. People who are grieving walk into traffic, people who are grieving forget to turn the stove off, people who are, it takes a physical toll. So it is a deep, deep reality. And we aren't always good at it in this culture, and we're not always good at it in the church. We have folks occasionally who will say, my spouse died, I can't come back for a while because I'm not ready to be happy yet. And I think we've done something wrong when folks feel like they have to be put together, they have to be pulled together, they have to be happy to be in church. We need to also sing songs of lament. We need to also sing songs of sorrow, to make sure folks are welcome there. We need Kleenexes in the pews, these
Mm.
small little things that can make people feel that their grief is welcome.
Mm. Mm. Isn't that beautiful? Just to think of a day. I think that later on you quote Bonhoeffer in saying like the true test, like moral test for a society is what world do we leave to our children? And that's what I was thinking a lot about that after I had read that and reflecting back on the contribution that you've made with writing on grief, that we can't just accept the fact that we're not great at it. Like that's not a healthy thing for ourselves, but it's also not a healthy thing for us to just continue to have pews with no Kleenex and expect people to be happy. Like I think that we have an opportunity right now to say, hey, let's learn and grow and explore this thing that we've maybe been uncomfortable with, but it's an avenue to hope. It's not something that we need to avoid. And I think the invitation there is really, really wonderful for people who say, oh, wow, I didn't know I was grieving. We just dropped our
Yeah.
oldest off at college. And so we sent away our firstborn
Mm.
to college, literally driving away from the college, crying, thinking I'm grieving. And I'm so happy I wouldn't want her anywhere else, but grieving the
Yeah.
change of, hey, that season will never be again. And to be able to be okay with that and to just know that we're all grieving something, an ice cream cone that drops, and that's a normal commingled part of reality is wonderful. So thank you for that. Is there a bird that is a symbol of grieving well? Like that, there were so many, the albatross, the pelican. I loved going through, but is there a bird that just like embodies for you, like just the picture, the overarching picture of an invitation to maybe grieve well with hope?
My very favorite bird and my only tattoo is the song sparrow. And they're small. They're all across the country. You have them in Florida. We have them here in California. They're not that much to look at. But what I love about the song sparrow is they keep singing no matter what the weather is doing. So they sing in the heat and they sing in the snow and they sing in the storm. And I think there's something to that idea of the song sparrow as an invitation to us in grief, that our song may change, but we're still invited to continue to sing. And we don't have to be bright and we don't have to be bold and we don't have to be flashy. But that invitation to God and that reminder that the story goes on and that God is present to us in the midst of our grieving.
Yeah, no, it's so good. I'm Zach Elliott, Executive Director of VUVIVO, and together with our partners, we are recovering the deep Christian tradition of standing behind the arts by making significant investment in visual art, music, and literature. We're working together with some of the world's most gifted fine artists, composers, and authors to wondrously reveal Christianity and invite people to know God personally. This work to recover the tradition of standing behind the arts is going to take a fresh generation of patrons committed to resourcing and releasing these great artists to use the highest and best of their gifts to the glory of God and for the good of the world. You can join us in that work by becoming a V3 partner. Reach out for more information or go to vuvivo.com/support to join us in standing behind the arts. You, in the book, there's grief. That you thank you for the definition and kind of helping us look at that a little bit. Death is different than grief, right? Death is something, and you say death unmoors us. And that really moved me. I had to kind of put the book down and think about that. But you have served as with hospice and as a pastor, and you've been near to death and dying in so many different ways. Say more about death unmooring us, because I felt like there was something there that was true, but maybe I didn't have language for it, but I felt it.
So I grew up in the North Woods of Wisconsin, and now I live here in Southern California. And I've yet to be in a major earthquake, but I've been in a minor earthquake. And the feeling when the ground is literally moving underneath you, like the one thing you thought was stable, the one thing that has never let you down, you've run on it and driven on it and laid down on it, is no longer safe. That's for me a picture of what death is. It's such a break, it's such a severing, and it's such a surprise, even when, I'm at the bedside of my 90-year-old grandfather who has been diagnosed terminal. We know that there's no recovery from this, but even in that, there's such shock because this is not the way things should be. This is not how we were designed, this. And so to have that severing, and the belief that I can pray and Jesus is taking care of grandpa and all those things is in that moment of small comfort when he's gone and he is not present here in the same way. And so death is the enemy, talked about in scripture. And I think even at the end for my grandfather, death was in many ways a relief, but still for the rest of us left behind was such a deep break. So yeah, just the sense that it should not be and it is not right.
Yeah.
Which I think is a God-given sense. And we are so quick to skip over that in the church. I'm a Presbyterian minister, and our memorial services, our funerals are designated as a service of witness to the resurrection. And yes, absolutely. But Jesus wept at Lazarus' tomb. There needs to be that moment to acknowledge the magnitude of death.
Yeah. No, I think it's important. And as a pastor, I want to ask you, in our moment, there's this tension I feel, and I think this is what I appreciated about you saying death unmoors us, because something happens. It doesn't matter if our grandfather is in his 90s, or it's the loss of a spouse, or the loss of a child, or even carrying a child in the womb, and we lose a child in pregnancy. And it does. We walk around as if the ground has shaken, and you describe that well. I meet people who say, well, death is natural, right? You describe it as not the way that it's supposed to be. And it's a final enemy to be defeated. And I think this is the Christian witness. This is part of why I am a Christian, because we can look at something and say, it's not the way that it's supposed to be. And there is something to be overcome, and Christ has overcome it. How do you handle that if somebody comes to you and says, but Pastor, death is natural. We see it in the natural world, and to escape the terrifying realities of grief, we need to get more comfortable with it. We need to accept it as natural. How do you navigate that when I hear you say, no, it's not the way it's supposed to be?
I think There is some wisdom to that idea that death is natural. When I trained for hospice, my supervisor was so good at saying things like, when you walk in the room and the person has already died, put a hand on their forehead, put your hand on their hand, like show the family you're not afraid. Show them that this is a natural physical process. Show them that, because it's scary. We're not around death and dying a lot in our modern society. I've spent a lot of time around it, but most folks who, don't work in ministry or hospice or the medical field don't spend much time there. Um, Death in the natural world is natural. The oak tree needs to fall and it needs to decompose, or we don't have healthy soil for the forest. And so I think we can hold these things in tension. We do hold these things in tension. And I meet with people who are in despair because someone died, of old age. And I have to say, we will all die. The Apostle Paul, great faith, not still walking around here. We have been given a set amount of years because of God's wisdom and God's goodness. And the goodness there is that this is not the end of the story. But I do think, developing more of an understanding of death, of the processes around death, hospice was such a great gift to me in that arena, can be really helpful to people. So it's not either or. I think it's both and.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you for that, because I think there is a great invitation. Doug Dale does this with The Lost Art of Dying, to face it and say, "Yep, there is a reality of death that shouldn't surprise us, right? We know it, and we also can have hope. Grief is an avenue to hope. We know that we will die. We know that death is a part of this human experience, and yet it's not the final word. It's not the last word. And
Yeah.
so it's an invitation and an avenue to hope. You describe hope, I think you say, is a long story, and that we can trust that hope is a long story. What do you say? And Paul Pastor, beautiful poet, said that he wrote his latest poetry collection for people that maybe feel like hope isn't for them. What do you
Mm.
say to someone who says, "I feel pretty locked in grief. I'm grieving, and I have been for a long time, and I thought that it would go away more quickly, or that I would be over it or get through it, and it's just seeming to be hanging around." And they
Yeah.
feel like maybe hope is not for them. You say hope is a long story, and we can trust that it's a long story. How would you help somebody who feels stuck in grief and like hope seems to be evading them?
Yeah, it's such a trick, right? Because you never want to make someone feel blamed or shamed for their own grieving process, and we all grieve differently. And I think we have choices along the way of that grieving process. And so often when folks are struggling with complicated grief, I would ask questions like, what do you go outside, and what are your friendships looking like? And because the temptations in grief are to isolate, they're to stay in, they're to really batten down the hatches. And I think there are seasons for all of us where we need some of that, where things are just too tender for the public. They're too tender to make it sometimes out the front door. But we can also get stuck. And I think we all get stuck from time to time, whether that's in grief or anything else. And to have a friend on the journey who will say, let's just go for a 15-minute walk and see what happens on the other side of that, because hope is a long story, and we also participate in many ways in our own recovery. The Apostle Paul tells us to work out our salvation with fear and trembling, and then the very next phrase is, because it is God who works in you. And you're like, well, which is it? Well, it's both. It's 2 feet walking. Faith is a gift, and also faith is a muscle. And so I think gently and without any blame or shame, I would ask some of those questions in hopes that I might be able to walk with that person a few steps closer to the light. And I think the other thing we need to say in the midst of that is, I think people often wait to feel normal after grief, after a major
Mm.
life trauma, a difficult event. And the normal may be very different. You may never quite feel like your old self again. You may be a new version. And that's okay too. And we can make space for that, and we can honor that in each other.
Yeah. It's so good to just be okay with things that we're not certain of, we have questions of. And you even at a point in the book say we think we need answers, and that's kind of our our default is that I need to get an answer for this. I need to get an answer for this. And sometimes we need to accept the fact that we may not get an answer in a particular way, but we can keep walking forward with hope. And again, that beautiful invitation to an avenue of hope and to start reimagining grief as an avenue towards hope is just a wonderful invitation. So if you're listening, looking up A Birder's Guide to Hope Through Grief, grab the book. I've been carrying mine around with me. It's tattered and marked up, and I love it. But it's filled with personal stories, moments, but also a lot of pastoral wisdom. And one of the things that was just so good was your description of love and loving God's good creation. And I heard you mention muscles a second ago, but you said loving God's good creation is an exercise in grief.
Yeah.
Yeah. I want to just invite you to kind of shift into teaching mode a little bit, because it was really important. When I read that, loving God's good creation is an exercise in grief. And what hit me was, okay, so there's this thing that's unknown to me. Yep. There's this thing that often I avoid. Yep. And also, I'm hearing you say that this thing is a very thing that is loving God's good creation is going to be an exercise in this thing that I don't have a lot of language for or experience with, and I often tried to avoid. Just have some open runway to teach us on loving God's good creation is an exercise in grief.
When folks first begin to fall in love with the natural world, whether that's birds or trees or flowers or insects, or, our children's director here at the church loves whales. She'll talk to you all day about whales. There is this wonderful honeymoon phase where it's like, oh, birds are everywhere. This is so amazing. They're beautiful and they're wonderful. And then slowly what begins to happen as you learn more about them is you start to also learn that some of them are near extinction and some of their habitats have been destroyed, and some of them are suffering because their habitat area is warmer than it used to be, or we built a giant Amazon warehouse next to it. And so this thing that first started out as pure joy and pure delight takes this turn of realizing, oh, we've done harm to creation and we continue to do harm to creation, and we have not always been good stewards. And many streams of Christianity have gone the, well, it's all going to burn anyway perspective, rather than God has tasked us to care for the earth. And then there is this moment of, do I want to continue loving this thing so deeply if it too is going to hurt me? It too is going to cause me pain. And part of that is the conservation angle and the ecology angle, but some of that too is, I read in the book about a little white pigeon we had in the backyard, a rock pigeon that the kids all fell in love with, and it hung around in our yard for months, and then one day it was gone. And white pigeons, pigeons aren't smart to begin with, but a bright white pigeon in a world full of hawks, I imagine it did not end well for the pigeon. But the more we love things, the more we are at risk for grief. And so there is a real challenge there. And I think there's a deep invitation of God to open up our hearts, not just to our neighbors, not just to strangers and the refugees, but also to open up our hearts to the natural world, knowing that that will break our hearts, but that God intends that and God will use that and help it to make us more human and more tender and more ready to do what God has for us.
Yeah.
But it's hard.
Yeah, it is hard. This is why I love your book and why I encourage everybody to get this book. Like the whole exercise at V3, the life and beauty of the gospel in the world, and how it comes through this seed that's planted that transforms our lives and allows us to live in a world that is beautiful and good, but also broken. And we get to embody a hope that the watching world looks to, and there is something beautiful that helps us discover what is good and know what is true, and our lives get to be that witness in the world. And we have an opportunity to deepen our fluency and our understanding of grief. And this book is a great way to, not only if you're facing grief or if you've been through a season of grief, but even if you find yourself dropping ice cream cones or dropping kids off at college, and just to deepen our capacity to grieve well and to see grief as an exercise in a part of what it means to love and be vulnerable and open ourselves up and deepen our capacity to love. If we're going to do that, then we're going to be exposed to grief. We're going to weep. And so let's weep well, and let's really have these conversations. And Courtney, thank you for just the craft of helping us through story and wisdom and invitations to begin to move in that direction, because some of it is scary. And I want to ask you, because one of the questions that comes up for people, death and dying, we want to avoid it because sometimes there's questions that we don't know the answer to and we don't want them. And people who have lost people, who they go, I don't know, I don't have assurance, it is well with my soul. And if I could wrap it up, put a bow on it and say, well, at least I know what's next for them, then I could grieve with hope. But there's cases where I don't know, and I'm left in that really strange space of unknowing. You write a simple prayer in the book that is beautiful, and I want to just invite you to talk about how that prayer has been helpful for you as a pastor in moments where they don't know what is next. They don't have something to hold on to confirm or guarantee that they can have certainty of somebody's resurrection future. You say the prayer is this: God loved him very much. Jesus died for their sins. The Spirit was present to them. That was so beautiful. I was imagining you pastoring beside somebody, asking deep questions and offering truth, but not trying to put a bow on some sort of answer for them. How has that been helpful for people? And as you've tried to do both of those things?
It's so desperately important not to ever lie from the pulpit. And I think, there's pressure, there's temptation to get up there and make promises and assurances that you don't have. Like at the end of the day, every person is a great mystery, and we don't know what was going on there. I don't know what was going on with my grandfather in the hours before he died. But what I do know is that prayer, that God was present to them, that Jesus died for them, that the Holy Spirit was surrounding them. And that is something I can say about anyone on this earth who dies. And that is the assurance that I have to offer. I was at a funeral a number of years back with a dear friend whose father had died, and the pastor got up and was like, we know beyond a shadow of a doubt. And she was sitting there in the front row because she's like, I lived with him, he did not love Jesus, like he was not, and folks are so hungry for truth and authenticity, but they're also hungry for comfort and assurance. And so how can we, with full integrity and deep gospel truth, offer them the only hope that any of us have, which is those three things?
Yeah. Yeah. God loved him very much. Jesus died for their sins, and the Spirit was present to them. You'll find that prayer and some other beautiful prayers, even at the end of life. Lots of wisdom in this book that we can take and apply in our context. It's a great pastoral book. Thank you for the work writing Looking Up, A Birder's Guide to Hope Through Grief. I know I got to be careful with your time, but I didn't feel like it was right. I got to know your grandfather just a bit through this book, and I couldn't wait for this conversation because I thought anytime we get a little distance in our grief, we start to look back and notice things or remember things that are sticky about these people, and they just stay with us, and they'll always be a part of us. There's those certain things, a song or a memory or an ice cream flavor or something that person gave us that does get to continue on. And I wondered, have you discovered one of those about your grandfather now, having more time, where you kind of look up and smile and think, man, he gave me this? Is there something that's uniquely your grandfather's that he's given to you that just makes you smile?
One of the things that was important to me in the book was that I wrote about my grandfather as he really was. And he was a complicated figure. He was kind of hermit adjacent. He was pretty grumpy, and he was himself. He was fully himself. And as I've thought about him in the years since he died, it's been 3 years now. It'll be 3 years. Or it will be 3 years this coming April. One of the stories that I remembered and told my kids was he lived in the North Woods of Wisconsin. in a house on a little lake, and he had a little dock that went out into the lake. And, as the years progressed, it started to lean more and more to the left. It's just, the dock was on its way out. But people, tourists usually from Chicago, would come up and rent boats, and they'd be all over his lake. And this drove him crazy. His nice, quiet retreat. He had lived his whole life in Chicago, moved to Wisconsin to get away from these people, and they'd be riding their boats around. And he was not a confrontational man. He was a very soft-spoken person in general. He was very introverted. And so he wasn't going to yell at the people when they anchored right off his dock to go fishing and steal what he referred to as his fish. He wasn't going to stage any sort of, confrontation with them. But what he would do, it's 90 degrees, it's the middle of the Wisconsin summer. He would go into his house and put on full rain gear, pants, shirt, coat, hat, the whole thing, and his boots, his waders, and he would walk out on the pier and just start muttering to himself. And before long, the people in the boat would look at this crazy man and they'd zoom right away. And I love that there is more than one way to solve a problem.
I love that.
And that speaks to his creativity and willingness to be a little bit goofy if it got him what he needed.
Oh, mightily effective, though. What a beautiful
Worked
strategy.
every time.
Yeah, for sure. That's awesome. Thank you for giving us a glimpse. It's all through the pages of the book of just you and your family and your grandfather. It was really, really a beautiful gift. And thank you for your work in the world as a pastor. You're a wonderful pastor, and the way that you pastor through grief is going to stick with me. It'll be something that I treasure and carry on. So everybody listening, I really do want to encourage you, get looking up A Birder's Guide Through Hope and Grief. You can find it on all the places where you buy your books, but it'll be a beautiful addition, not just to your library, but I really pray that it would enrich our capacity to travel this avenue towards hope and do it in a really winsome and wise way. So Courtney, thank you, thank you, thank you. If people are looking forward to weathering change and the next book coming out, I think it comes out in February, where would you send people to say, hey, come find me here, or you can get ready for the launch of that book and make sure you don't miss anything and opportunities to hear from you in other venues? Is there a place that people can come if they are introduced to you and your work and want to keep following in that direction?
For sure. I have a Substack, Courtney Ellis, and I write there once a week or once every other week. And then in the interim weeks, the podcast comes out, The Thing with Feathers. I'm also at CourtneyBEllis.com. I'm on social media. And I really encourage folks, if they're going to pre-order a book, which is such a gift to authors, especially new authors like me, do it at your local independent bookstore. Give that little community a lift, because we're all in it together.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. We'll go find the book and find Courtney. We'll put some of those links in to the Substack and things like that. But Courtney, thank you for the gift of this book, and hopefully we can come back around, and I would love another conversation on the next book. But this one has been a really treasure. So thank you.
Thank you for the gift of your show and the work you're doing with truth and beauty out there in the world. It's a gift to many of us.
Yeah, we can be partners in this beautiful thing. I appreciate it.